Well, good day. I want to welcome everybody to Stories About Digital Storytelling, Past, Present, and Future. And I'm Mark Corbett Wilson. And joining me today are Joe Lambert of StoryCenter.org and Jim Groom of Reclaim Hosting. So at the same time, I'm the oldest and the youngest in this deal. So I'll be relying on them for the history, and then we'll move into the present and into the future. So I just wanted to start with the definition. Good old Wikipedia says that digital stories are short vignettes that combine storytelling with still pictures, video clips, music, and text using a variety of video software. And it says that digital storytelling is a short form of digital media production that allows everyday people to create and share their stories online. This method is frequently used in schools, museums, libraries, social work, health settings, and communities. They are thought to have educational, democratizing, and even therapeutic effects. So I thought Wikipedia did a pretty good job on that. So I'll kick it off and just say that I am the newcomer here. I was a glassblower for 4 decades, but happened to be in Silicon Valley in 2008. So we know how that turned out. But I supported the computer industry for, 30 of those years off and on, but 20 years in Santa Clara, California. And once that went away, I decided, well, maybe I'll start using this junk that I've helped people build. But all along, I knew programmers and engineers, and they'd invite me over to their house. And I'd take my little 6 pack of beer, and they'd say, "Oh, man, look at this. I got this new apple. It looks like a giant purple jelly bean." And I'd be like, "Okay." We'd open a beer. And I wait a while and I say, "Well, what's it doing now?" So, "Well, I'm connected to the dial up." Okay. "What's it doing now?" Second beer. And they say, "Well, now I'm downloading that game I wanted to show you." Okay. And so it went like that through the whole time, except I got a job in my local bookstore to get a discount. So my side gig was working there, and I had to use Windows 98, and there got to be a point where it didn't crash every couple hours. And so that's when I finally got interested in using these machines. Um, then, after 2009, I went back to school, and of course, there I really got the opportunity to learn some of this stuff. Um, I got inspired to get into student leadership as a middle-aged man. That's a different story that we won't go into. But in 2013, I got invited to a public narrative workshop based on the works of Marshall Gans. And then in that workshop, I heard about Story Center. I was in Oakland, California. And so Story Center was just across the northern border. And so I went there, and that's where I met Joe. And then after that, I bumped into DS 106 and met Alan and Brian and now Jim. So it's been a long, strange trip, as we say. Well, I guess I'll just stop there, and I'll ask Joe to start with the early days, and then we'll have Jim jump in and fill in.
What's interesting about this, Mark, is that you and I have just finished the first Voices of the Future Present workshop, which was a AI generative digital storytelling workshop where people were riding into the near or distant future. And so here we are talking about the past, but you and I and Jim and the whole project here are playing with the future right now, as has been said by Mr. Gibson. The future is here; it's just unevenly distributed, and so some of us are getting to play in that kind of future tense right now. But to look back on it, I like the way those things are defined around digital storytelling because it privileges the work I've done. So I'm happy when anything sounds like I've won a brand war around what the hell could digital storytelling mean. But in fairness, what we're talking about is there were aspects of the digital media revolution that made things more accessible, and that meant more people were going to be expressing themselves in kind of slightly new ways. Arguably, the newest ways were hypertextual and interactive and things that you couldn't do with your television set or you couldn't do with a video camera or whatever. They were the aspects of this. we got on the sort of leading edge and then became the back edge of what digital video meant. It's like, well, what's digital video different than analog video? Well, one, it's cheaper. It was cheaper even sort of to begin with. When the old video editing thing, you had to have 2 or 3 decks. You had to go through, if you made a mistake, you had to start over. There were all sorts of things that cost time or money. And we knew that digital video was going to go down in cost based on Moore's law. And so when we started our work in the 1990s, with my collaboration with a technologist, artist, performing artist named Dana Atchley, our interest was as much about interactivity, but we were also going, well, wouldn't it be great if everybody could edit a video? And even back then, I think I said, and Jim, I don't know where literacy fits into your perspective, but I knew as an old school Marxist political activist guy, it was like the border between reading and not reading was an economic border. Literacy was an economic thing. If you were more literate, you made more money. And I kind of knew the 21st century would have screen literacy as a border. Either you do it or you don't. If you do, you've got more options, more possibilities. And if you don't, you'll have less possibilities. You'll have less mobility. You'll have less economic, viability. So I think we were already going, oh, this is just a grand literacy campaign to get as many people using screen culture as possible. So it naturally pushed us toward education. But because of my background in theater and particularly what was called solo performance in the 80s, working with the Whoopi Goldbergs and the Spalding Grays and Eric Bogosians, all these characters that were, frankly, a cheaper way to produce theater because there's just one person on stage. But we learned a lot about personal storytelling, and we learned a lot about the shamanistic value of somebody getting deep into their own story and projecting it in the world. So we were bringing that intelligence into this. Let's play with Premiere 1.0 and Photoshop 1.0 in 1992. We like the idea that this would become both a very deeply personal expressive space, but also a collective social space for people to do work together. So I promised, Jim, I don't know if you've ever seen Tanya, the movie Tanya. Probably not. So you're going to have an experience that's part of the initiation ritual in which we share the creation myth of our version of digital storytelling, which was once upon a time, Dana got invited to hold the first digital video production workshop in the United States at the American Film Institute in February of 1993. And he dragged me and his tech guy, a guy named Patrick Milligan, down there. And I stayed at the Roosevelt Hotel for one night, but Patrick snored so loudly that I said, even though this is Hollywood and I'm at, where the Oscars started, I'm getting the hell out of this hotel because he's killing me. I've never been with somebody who snored like that. And so we did a workshop. And at the end of the workshop, it took 2 days to render the files. So the great Harry Marks, who gave us the wild world of sports roll in, the joy of victory, agony of defeat. He gave us the NBC ABC Sunday night at the movies. Harry Mark's a very famous guy. So we had a salon, and it was 2 days later. So we screened all the movies from the workshop 2 days later. One person had told a story about a dear friend of hers. She showed up 45 minutes late, and she said, I've been sitting in the car talking to my dear friend Tanya, who died 3 hours ago. And so the ghost of Tanya was keeping her busy. And then we showed this movie. So let me present this film. He says with great, great confidence that this is going to work. I do want the audio on. It is. There's audio on, and I want this video. So let's hope you guys hear this. 1993 Premiere 1 on a Quadra 840. I remember all that machine. Here we go.
I never had a lot of friends. Not really. The truth is I didn't even know what one was. Growing up, I was shy and confused friendship with popularity. Last year I met Tanya and we became the kind of friends that most friends are, acquaintances. She knew she had AIDS and would die soon, but facing death gave her more strength to live. She had no place to leave her girls and wanted to find them a good home. Tanya also wanted to start an organization to help parents like herself die in peace, knowing their children were loved and cared for. She also needed a real friend. Tanya got a lot of attention the minute she told her story, as if the world had been waiting for her. I stood by and watched in amazement. A few months later, she couldn't do much on her own, and for all her efforts, she felt she had only accomplished one thing. She found a real friend, and it was me. And I couldn't let her dreams die with her. The other night, Tanya told me to lay my head down next to hers. She wanted to tell me a secret. Monty Faye, don't forget, all we got is where we're going. Couldn't believe she knew my middle name. Oh, I hate to see her go. Well, listen.
So in that little minute and 36-second piece, using 16 images, one little clip of video, she sort of told us what our future would be. And what it was about people processing things that happened. I don't know how many memorial pieces I've done since then. I've never done one that was being done in the process where the person was essentially passing away in real time, side by side to the workshop, and was gone before the movie could be shown. But she was also telling a story about LA in 1990. People remember the LA riots and Rodney King and the racial strife. And here was a white woman and a black woman befriending each other across that border. She would drive to the hospice center, newly built hospice center that was in Compton, and connect with her. And I interviewed Tanya 20 years later, and I now have his Facebook friends. I mean, not Tanya, Monty Faye, Monty Ellis, the maker. I interviewed Monty and became Facebook friends with with Tanya's daughters, to sort of see legacy, right? So what we knew is that our work was going to have something very personal, but also something very political. Inside of that story is also public health, right? AIDS, the AIDS crisis, and how it affected heterosexual poor people. It wasn't just a gay crisis. It was a heterosexual poor people's crisis. And this person was brave enough to talk about those kind of issues in a public way. And you see in there, she was on Dateline. She was on all these TV things, but that story didn't matter. And what do we remember from that day when she said, I've got this huge story. How are you going to put it in small package? And I said, well, what's the story only you can tell? And she said, it's about learning what friendship is. And she nailed it. And so I could use that story for years to teach storytelling. And even though it's a minute and a half, I could teach essential issues of storytelling. And so what happened over those first 2 to 3 years is we began to develop our methods and say, here's the way a workshop works, and here's the way we bring people into story, our 7 elements of digital storytelling. We got Apple to pay for the publication of the first cookbook at a digital storytelling festival in 96. And suddenly we had a method. And side by side it, we had a national community through our annual festivals that happened, first 5 years in Crested Butte and a couple of years in Sedona. We had a way to talk to all the other makers who were doing interesting things. But our workshop became kind of the anchor of that particular international community. Moved to Berkeley in 98, became the Center for Digital Storytelling. We had been called the San Francisco Digital Media Center. Became CDS, and CDS remained the same until 2015. Essentially taking this method from a very local kind of process in San Francisco's Mission District to a national, international project that had us working in countries all over the world, as it has. We've traveled everywhere, all 50 states, some 93 countries so far, and we've done all sorts of work. Along the way, this is where I'm going to throw it to you, Jim. Along the way, people were thinking about digital storytelling in education in particular in a new way. And, roughly between 98 and 2006, suddenly I go to a conference, I'd be the only person speaking about digital storytelling. I go back the next year and there'd be 32 presentations on digital storytelling. And I would work with networks like New Media Consortium and Alan November's group in K-12 education and other groups to get the word out. The National Writing Project, which was based at Berkeley with us, had their network getting digital storytelling on. And then we looked over and we saw some cool people at the University of Mary Washington. Did I get that right? Doing this thing called DS 106. And we were like, they're mooking the shit out of us. This is amazing. What the hell is going on? So, Jim, I'm throwing it over to you. Tell us about that creation myth. I gave you my creation myth, so you can now give us your creation myth.
Yeah, actually, that was amazing to hear, Joe. I mean, just that Tanya story and like how it became genre forming, and from a decade and a half since because I come into the story and very marginal, like not international, not particularly influential. But I come into the story in 2010, and my story is a little bit less exciting. I mean, I was approached because they needed an adjunct, they needed cheap labor, so the politics in the class stuff was there. And I was an instructional technologist at Mary Washington, and I love to teach. I've been teaching literature was my background more than anything. But they were like, it's a computer science class, but you can do the storytelling piece. And my real focus at that point was social media and doing stuff like blogging, Twitter, YouTube, just kind of various media. And it wasn't really my vision. I think our group's vision at the Division of Teaching and Learning Technology at UMW was about giving students the tools, much like you, Joe, to kind of tell their stories. And this is a kind of educational focus, so to narrate their work. I think the piece that was most important for me was not so much the end product, although I'll be interested in it because they're interested in it, but how they narrate the creation process. I think that for me is always the most interesting piece. Case in point, for anyone listening to the radio, we heard a great session before this by Taylor talking about, an interview with Dr. Oblivion, which has a whole DS106 history. But for me, the key piece was the last 10 minutes when he kind of demystified the process and talked about the actual creation and was teaching us through what he learned. And for me, I thought social media was a key space where if students had their own domain, they had their own website or blog or you name it, they could start telling those stories and narrating their learning, and by definition, decenter the class and create a networked effect of learning, which I think was a really powerful idea. People like Gardner Campbell have been talking about network effects. Like, this was a powerful vision, and I think DS106, at least as I saw it develop from 2010 to 2012, was a really good example of kind of harnessing network effects to allow students to realize they're learning in a collective. And they're able to kind of share their work and get feedback, not just from the faculty member at the center, but from people who are in Portugal, Australia, Japan. Like, it kind of came from everywhere. And then Grant Potter, so that's kind of 2010, 2011. 2011, I think our inspiration, Joe, was the politic of our inspiration to some degree was the kind of birth of the MOOC. So there was discussion in higher ed with people like Stephen Downs and George Siemens about this creation of a free online open class, which later became tagged as a MOOC. And I was very interested in that idea. And so we had a great group at Mary Washington. And so Martha Burtis and myself in 2011 taught a class where we had 30 students in each class, but both the classes were basically commingled. And anyone who wanted to take the class from around the world could basically sign up. And using feeds and RSS and a kind of mother blog, we could pull everything in. And what we found, which I think was for us, the magic of the moment was Twitter was an unbelievable networking tool to bring all the voices that were in that class in 2010, 2011 together in a seamless space. And it works very well, Mark, with your idea of past, present, future, because over the course of years of DS-106, you'd have students who had taken it years ago giving feedback to students who are taking it now. And that idea of a present, a past, and a future in a community is what makes it a community. Otherwise, it just dies, right? Because it happens for 15 weeks and then goes. But when people remain committed or interested or involved over the course of years, which we've seen with DS-106, and it's a very small community in some ways, but it's a very active and very overly committed, I would say, community. It has really, for me, opened up the idea of, there are ways to use these almost, I would say, unlike the more traditional stories that, Joe, you kind of, and you did win the brand more, like we were reacting to your digital storytelling because it was so prominent and it was so defined. So in many ways, we're like, the story is not going to be very clear. It's not going to be a minute and a half. In fact, it's going to be disjointed. It's going to be across several media, and it's going to be an ongoing kind of reflection point over time that doesn't end. And it becomes the story of the learner. And it's obviously branded or framed for our community, which is education, but also for the way in which the media itself was disaggregating and was kind of becoming, Twitter kind of exemplified this very well, almost pointless, right? You didn't know where the idea was coming from. You didn't know where the beginning and the end of that conversation started or the beginning and the end of that story was. It was in many ways totally in media res. The whole thing was happening as it happened. And I was really interested in this disjointed nature of the story in social media and the web. And I think that's just one view, because the thing that was cool about DS-106 is Alan Levine taught it, Paul Bond taught it, Michael Branson Smith at the City University of New York taught it. Martha Burtis taught it. So many different people taught it in so many different ways that it didn't become an overarching kind of process. What did happen, though, that was consistent and fun is we started to bring in themes. So DS-106 was just a kind of capsule, right? And so you could fill it with whatever you wanted. So you would maybe use certain set of tools and you talk about creating images or video or radio or audio or mashups, you name it. We had all these different things, kind of like a format. But whatever you wrote about had to be of interest to you. Mm-hmm. So it kind of relocated, like you did, Joe, the stories to the learner. And they would be the ones who were communicating back. And then we started doing things like the DS-106 zone. So it was themed where we would watch Twilight Zone episodes together and then riff off them. And then we did that with The Wire. And I bring this up, this is my last point, because The Wire was super interesting to me. We watched 5 seasons of The Wire together over the course of a semester. And someone who since came to work with me, her father and I met each other, him not knowing that I was her professor during her undergrad. He's like, UMW, can you believe we paid a professor so that she could watch The Wire all semester? And that was me. And the idea here was that these students not only told stories about The Wire or remixed The Wire, they would create entire social profiles of characters on The Wire. So B.D. Russell, who was the security guard at the Baltimore dock, basically had a Twitter account that one of my students created and was kind of acting out the role of B.D. Russell. Omar, who's a great figure in The Wire, had a LinkedIn account where you would go in and see the kind of narrative told about Omar as if he was putting up a LinkedIn account. And I was super fascinated by this because I think my students were starting to realize that all of these different media are ways of telling their story. And it started to get kind of different when things like Instagram came around and Twitter was no longer valuable for an educational community, things started to change, and the class itself had to reevaluate some of its assumptions. But it was still very much embedded in the way in which our own identities were being fractured across these different platforms, and how we kind of maintain that sense of consciousness in this new space. And so that was, I don't know if it's I don't think it's a very good myth story, because it's still filled with all sorts of uncertainty, and whether it really happened or not, it's like the Big Bang, I guess. It's like, did that really how it happened? But that's the closest I can get to a coherent discussion of DS-106.
Yeah, the riff that I have was that Mark shared with me that you have some sort of punk scholarship background. And suddenly, to go slightly metacognitive, I was thinking about the educational theories of Peter Kropotkin, the anarchist theorist, who frankly influenced Dewey, influenced Freire, influenced the Summerhill schools, influenced all these kind of worlds of independent thinking about the way education could actually help liberate people. And anarchists don't get a lot of credit. Mark knows the story that for 30 years almost, I had the email from 84 to 2014 of jello@well.com, because I was an early member of the Well. And so I would always get emails for Jello Biafra of the dead Kennedys, which was great, because when I was at Cal, they would play at Barrington Hall or whatever. But I always had a dearness, even though I was more of a Leninist than an anarchist. I always had a dearness for the idea of when people go into intention, like you were just describing with DS-106, and they're given just enough to make sense of it for themselves, that there is this conscientization that happens in process. The products, and I feel that way, 90% of our work is process. It has a product. Our product's cool. Yeah, they're cool. But what we want people to take is the idea of process, of what it means to be listened to, what it means to listen to others, and how creativity comes from a sense of clarity of communication in a very small sense, meaning would my mother like this story, with my sister, with my brother, and to me, that's a really interesting aspect of the way this world of digital storytelling has grown. It's grown in this sort of, oh, we get that. And again, in certain corners of education, clearly yours, that was received well. In other corners, not so much, because people will still want to make experts. They want to make somebody who's a storyteller, as opposed to saying, we're all storytellers. What the hell? And we all can connect each other through different kinds of mediums and expressive formats that have a narrative component. So that was my and bring anarchism into the discussion, Jim. Sorry about that.
No, that's great. And to your point, I mean, one of the things I think was really, I'll never teach alone again as a result of DS-106. There's that, the idea of distributing. I mean, how fortunate was everybody to have a network like that was well beyond the 30 people in the classroom, and was really just a great group of people who really wanted to help. And I was kind of very much blown away by that. But I was also blown away by the fact when you tell a student, well, write about things you're interested in. And there's a series of assignments, an assignment bank that Martha Burtis created, that you could submit assignments you found across the internet. And if you don't like the assignments, you submit your own. And then you do them. And then you narrate how you did them and what your thinking was. And for me, it just all started to come together. Like, these students were teaching each other. They were part of a network. It was kind of student, and this was, for me, the height of the class was the student professor, student teacher breakdowns. I mean, division started to break down, and entirely. And the expert started to be questionable, because I was always, questionable in my expertise around digital storytelling. Period. Like, I don't come in with any badges around digital storytelling. I had an idea and a group of people around me that would run with it. And I think the students took that energy, and they did. And all of us benefited, I think, as a result. So that was really for me was that expertise thing. I wasn't interested in that. What I was interested in is students, coming, reflecting, and really also engaging with their, fellow online network companion, like giving them a real assessment of their work and encouragement or, critiques or feedback. And so commenting became a huge part of it. And then memes and GIFs became a huge part of it because as DS106 was emerging, so were GIFs. GIFs were on the way back. And GIFs were perfect because they were the most concise storytelling you could imagine. And they were also often used for effect or emotion or encouragement or just fun. And I think the thing that maybe is distinct about DS106 from a more kind of robust digital storytelling is that it was kind of always tongue in cheek. It was kind of always humorous. I don't think we could ever go as cleanly as Tanya did, or as the narrator talking about Tanya did, because I mean that takes it to another level, right? That's like literature. That's like profound documentary.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we were always kind of comfortable with being a little bit jokey and reflective, but not always feeling confident in our expertise to be fully, I would say, profound. Even though profound things came out of it, I don't think that was ever the intention.
Yeah, see, I think that's where the punk element was always part of it. I got drawn in by the Western 106, which we did a show Monday about that one because of my Western background. So that drew me in to DS 106, and I got to learn all these things, including how to hand roll a GIF. So I want to drag us into the present here for a few minutes before we get to the future.
Well, go ahead and lead us in. I saved one other movie as a transition for our poor audience that's hearing us talking our heads. I'll show it or I won't show it. But, Mark, where do you want us to go?
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to use it as a transition to the present. So the art form of digital storytelling's evolved a lot, and this example that I'm going to quickly show because I don't want to over introduce it is just kind of it's showing where the depth of this has gone and how the elegance of the form has gone. So let me just do this really quickly because I know we will run out of time if we don't hurry. Here's Love Apple by Denise Gant. She's a cultural worker in Baltimore.
The year my mother joined her people, I planted 1,000 tomato seeds for a yard that can only sustain 10 plants. This is the kind of insanity that grief breeds. My mother died in January 2019. By February, my narrow windowsills teemed with exotic names. Azoishka, Constelluto Genovese, Silvalente, Drusba. I grew so many black tomatoes, but in my haste to escape my pain, I forgot to plant seeds for my favorite black, Paul Robeson. I watched the seedlings like an expectant mother. Every day waited for their true leaves to fracture the light. I hoped my mother would show up in May when I sat on the rusted chair, played Nina Simone in a haze of Nag Champa, and transplanted the seedlings to their final resting place. In July, I imagined she grew as impatient as I was, waiting for that first ripe tomato. My mother despised mayonnaise and preferred her love apples almost naked. She sliced them open, placed salt on their innards, then swooned. A foodie long before there was such a word, she learned to make spaghetti sauce from an Italian woman she babysat for in Philadelphia during the 50s. In 1969, we became the first black family on the block in a Lubbock suburb, but Maryland never became home to my mom, aka Aunt Sis, Nana, E.T. She wrote a children's story she loved to read me about an African princess named If Me. Had an IQ of 180. My mom left so many dreams unmet, wobbling on the kitchen floor. Until the multiple myeloma came, she loved to brag. No one in our family ever gets cancer. October, I was still clipping diseased leaves from the plants in a futile attempt to stop death. But everything that makes the soil sweet comes from decomposition. My mom weighed less than 90 pounds the last time I saw her alive. As her breath waned, the plants outside her hospice window whistled in the cold evening air, like the dead plants I just couldn't bury. My brother thinks I should grow fewer, but I won't. Growing tomatoes is the one place where I can find my mother and not collapse. In my garden, salt tastes like sweat, not sorrow. If I could, I would plant 1,000 acres of love apples. And even that would not be enough to cry her back to me.
As you said, Jim, the art form that we created now has expressions like this all over the planet. And the presence of this new way of expressing yourself in multimedia context gives, huge numbers of people a way to hold what life gives them, both in the very personal sense or the social sense. I just shared that as because I think people see it's evolved, it's changed, it's become richer, deeper, more profound. And I think that's the reason the work has, sustained itself as an international movement of sorts, because people see these things and they're transformed through the process of making them and being part of a group of people making them. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Mark. We're all crying now because that story just, I don't know, it just.
So to give Jim the inside baseball here, I probably should have mentioned that today's the anniversary of the 50th anniversary of the passing of Joe's father. So we can see he's in a mood today.
But I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
Well, it was 50 years ago, so I've gotten over it, sort of. You're 17 years old, you lose your dad. That's one of the many stories I've told that terrible night. So here we are 50 years later talking about stories. Anyway, Mark.
Do you think that informed your whole movement? Was you dealing with that?
My parents were political activists in the American South, union, civil rights, everything. So I grew up in a household where people's right to have their voices heard was very important. My dad was particularly like me. He would go into a small town like Norma Ray, and he would collect stories and put them into a newsletter and pass the newsletter out at the company gate to sort of say, this union cares about who you are and what's really going on in your life, and these stories of what you need to survive working at a garment plant in Paris, Texas, or someplace like this. We care about this. And so, if you have a union contract, you're getting more than maybe a better wage. You're belonging to something bigger than yourself. Yeah, I learned that from him, and his commitment to that was, complete. Killed him, so to speak. But I think that same impulse informed everything I've done. The real focus of our work is enabling justice to happen by allowing the most silent parts of ourselves, or the silent stories in our culture, the erased cultures in our society, to be heard. And that emphasis has informed the integrity of our work. Not perfectly, but enough that I think it's natural that I'm my dad's son. Right? I am very much my dad's son.
This is one of the reasons Joe and I discovered that we're sort of brothers from another mother. My father died when I was 11, so we're coming up on the 60th anniversary of that. And he was a craftsman, and there you go. it's
The old
interesting.
working class. The old working class. God damn it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he managed an office to make money, but
Yeah.
he spent his time
Unlike
hunting rocks.
unlike you two, my dad's 88 and I can't get rid of him.
Oh well.
Yeah, I have a friend who has his 97-year-old father living with him. So yeah, it's life works its way out in different ways.
It works the other way too, right?
Yeah, it does. All right, we got to move this along. What I wanted to mention about the present was the wonderful work that Reclaim's doing in this new world where now we're moving into these federated media. And so recently, Reclaim has been good enough to put on these Flux trainings. And so now I have a new instance of Ghost in Reclaim Cloud. And, it's hooked to Podbean and I'm blanking on the other thing PeerTube. Because I studied digital humanities at the University of Victoria, and so we learned about archiving and all these different things. And it's been fun this week to look at the old DS-106 sites and to just surf through all the broken links. It's just wonderful. And it's not unique to DS-106. It's the whole internet. And so that's an important issue, that I'm looking at. So Reclaim is really leading the way, like they did with Domains of One's Own, into these federated technologies, with your Discord channel and all these different ways, and building community through these federated technologies. So I just wanted to mention that there's a lot going on in the present. We've been doing a lot of reminiscing here, but there's a lot going on. So I wanted to just quickly, because we do want to get to the future. If Jim, you'll want to say something about that, and Joe, anything you want to add?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting, the present moment, because like you said, it's in flux, and whether federation will prove to be an answer, or whether an answer or not, maybe that's the wrong way to frame it, whether it will get momentum versus, the consolidated. You thought when Twitter went down, maybe people would reconsider that, but everyone's gone to LinkedIn or back to Facebook or, so the platform wars and the consolidation of people's stories in those platforms, for me, is sad. I mean, because obviously you're fueling there's two ways to look at that. You just want to get your story out. You don't care what platforms it's on. I understand that. People are on the platform. That's why you're there. You want to communicate with them. I understand that too. I mean, I'm not a purist. But at the end of the day, I do believe that the stuff we do online is best managed and archived by you. Because no one else really cares about your work in the end. So I believe in kind of finding the tools that will help me or communities do that. And some of the tools you brought up, I really love Ghost as an alternative to WordPress for blogging and storytelling, and now it's federated, so you can share it wherever, right? And that's really the vision. Like, whether or not you feel the way I do about these social media silos, you still want to be able to share it with people there, and vice versa. And so tools like Ghost and Federation allow for that.
And this way we'll be able to find stuff in the future if we own it.
Well, none of those sites, including Federation, have really figured out search very well. So I wouldn't put that in a Federation and search in a feather in Federation's cap for sure. But I think interesting things could be happening there. And I think it's interesting that there is even a small slice of the community that's like, let's not make that mistake again. Yeah. Let's find an alternative, even if it's not perfect, and explore it. And I like that because I like to explore the alternatives and see where they go and kind of be on the ground floor of something as it's emerging, whereas be on the kind of, sinking ship of a Facebook or a LinkedIn. It's just, it's, I don't want to go back to high school. I don't want to go back to that moment and relive it again and again on templated Facebook. It's depressing.
And the educators are making the effort, over on Mastodon and Blue Sky, and unfortunately a lot on LinkedIn. But the educators did move away from Twitter and Facebook, and so hopefully they'll coalesce. And when I was referring to archive, at least, if I have a copy of my stuff, I can move it from platform to platform, where, these new tools don't lock you in and destroy your stuff is the important thing. So yeah, Ghost could go away, but as long as I have my markdown files, I can go to some other platform. So,
and I agree with you. And that was the great value of WordPress, because WordPress remained open source for so long, and it still is. And you could export and move other places. And so early on, that was a good choice we made at UMW. And I still believe open source tools will provide you with that kind of protection against lock-in and protection against a platform going terribly wrong like Twitter. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot to consider just in how the whole ecosystem has changed very, very recently.
So I have a very short clip to get us from the present to the future. Here's something that happened a couple days ago. So I always found that fascinating. And I guess the thing I'd say about New Mexico that I love the most, now we just had us a big earthquake right here live on the radio. So there you go. You got to love live radio.
That worked.
Yeah, that cognitive pause as you hear the building shake, you kind of go, huh?
Yeah, well, there's still damage all around where I live here from the '87 earthquake, and that's on the same fault. So I had a thought there for a moment. But anyway.
So it was a real earthquake?
Yeah.
Yeah,
10 miles from where I was sitting. And I'm on the second floor of an old, 50s apartment building that's got some metal posts under parts of it. It was good. Oh. Anyway, so that's my present presentation. All right. So when Joe said that we were teaching a class about the future of storytelling, he meant last hour. We finished the last session of that course, and we had our little screening of everybody's stories. So let me throw it over to you, Joe, and tell us how you came up with that.
Well, I think what's important for the audience, because there's a conference series that seemingly has started now. Arizona State University, their CIO, a guy named Lev Gonick, invited me a year and a half ago to help co-organize something he called the 100 Years Project, which was to look at education 50 years back and 50 years forward. We had our inaugural conference back in late February, Leap Day. It seemed like a great future forward idea. And we'll have our next one in March at the University of Texas, San Antonio. So the 100 Years Project had me design the way I thought it would be good to discuss the future. And so we created these 8 future stories, scenarios. I have a background of working with the Institute for the Future out in Menlo Park back in the early 2000s. And we use scenarios in a lot of different contexts. So I created these stories that used AI generative imagery and essentially written like small scripts of moments in the future related to education and things going wrong or right or in between. And so the stories became the way the groups were organized. They would have all looked at the story, and then a group of 15 to 20 people would then discuss what the implications of that story were. And then the end of the conference was them presenting things that they think need to be considered in planning to address or connecting to these kinds of issues, like cultural representation in AI, something a lot of people are very concerned about. So we had a whole group talking about that, and they came back and presented thoughts on that. So the idea for me was, well, I generally have people talk about their past and present. I've never had people write fiction into their future, but being a huge fan of like science fiction in general, and particularly Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry of the Future book, I've been really interested in the way that we, imagine. And again, to my father, he gave me Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward when I was a kid, which was maybe the first utopian novel. And I've been thinking about that way of telling for a while. So we did 6-week version of this with 11 or 12 students as part of Story Center's offering. Mark did a really great story that gave his background as it was sort of his resume meets who he'd be in 10 years helping other people out in a world that showed, the role that story work has in creating cohesion in the very pluralistic world that we would prefer rather than the very fractured world we're in. And that was just one of many great examples. It was a good screening as far as I'm concerned. I didn't know what more you want me to say, other than I invite people to look for the 100 Years Project at the University of Texas, San Antonio. I think it's March 20th, roughly, then next year, and we'll be getting the word out and having the normal conference call for participation in the weeks to come.
Well, I just happened to have that audio from my story, so I was going to play that. Isn't this great? The woman turns to her friend. I know, he replied. I've always wanted to share my stories. Despite the hubbub in the room, I couldn't help but overhear them. It's taken years of work, but I'm creating hubs for digital storytelling in libraries, museums, small businesses, and community centers. Now that college costs millions of dollars, I'm working with lifelong learners outside traditional education. I sit down with a middle-aged healthcare worker. She shows me the different views of her e-portfolio of digital stories that she presents to her friends and family and prospective employers or clients. I reflect on my own journey, from bookseller to writer, mainframe computers to critical digital humanism, and my decades of scientific glassblowing in Silicon Valley, to now teaching workers, students, and seniors how to create e-portfolios where they can demonstrate all their learning, formal and informal.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, one of the funny, I was part of speaking of the future past, I was part of a session hosted by Alan Levine in Second Life, run by an organization you had talked about, Joe, NMC. And the conceit was that there was a person who was calling back from the future to let everybody know, what was happening. And that was Brian Lamb, who was calling back to the future. And he was basically saying, I'm from the future, and here's what you have to look forward to. And what you have to look forward to is you need insurance for your higher education degree, because if you flunk out, you're going to be broke, and so you need to protect yourself against that. So it's very much in line with your future, Mark, in terms of millions of dollars for higher ed. And I thought it was super funny because this person coming in the future was actually just an insurance salesman trying to sell the listeners insurance for their top dollar education plan. And so it was kind of like a fun skit, but a way to tell a story about, almost a dystopic future that, with the way in which costs and, lack of things like union, that lacks of things of like organization and basically investment in education infrastructure that we're looking at. And scarily, that was only 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And it's kind of true. You can buy insurance for your kids' education now. It is not a myth. It is the real thing. So the future, I don't know. I'm nervous, about that. I like when I see things like Taylor Jaden's amazing interrogation of AI, which happened the hour before. It was super interesting. It was really creative, really thoughtful, and I like that idea of AI as a co-pilot and something to be interrogated. But I don't really feel any inspiration around the AI. I feel left cold. And so I am looking for more of what we're doing right now. Just talking with people and sharing those stories and having a good time doing it.
Joe?
Amen. No, my comment is we need to go, and we've used up our hour. And everybody we had an audience for, thank you for listening, and thank you, Mark, for organizing. It's been great.
Yeah, I want to thank everybody. Hopefully, in the future, people will drop in and give this a listen. There's a lot of great history here, and hopefully, it'll give them something to think about for the future.
Thank you. Good to spend time with you, Jim.
You too, Joe. Take care, everybody.
Well,
Bye.
bye.